She was 77 years old, and for most of her life, she believed it was simply too late. Too late to chase dreams. Too late to take risks. Too late to climb anything, especially that mountain. But what if everything she believed was wrong? Maggie had always been careful, cautious, the kind of woman who didn't like surprises. She lived in a quiet neighborhood in Virginia, in the same modest house where she had spent most of her adult life. Her days were peaceful, predictable. A cup of black coffee at 6 in the morning. A slow walk to her mailbox. A bit of gardening, if her knees allowed it. And in the evenings, an old RCA radio playing softly in the background, bringing her back to simpler times. Her neighbors saw her as gentle, wise, and kind. But no one knew about the fear that had followed her for decades. It wasn't fear of the dark or of being alone. The loneliness had become a familiar companion. It wasn't even fear of death. Maggie's greatest fear was something deeper, something she had carried like a shadow. She was terrified of dying with her dreams still locked inside her. There was a mountain, not too far from where she lived. She had seen it 1,000 times, from a distance, rising quietly over the hills. As a child, she would stare at it for hours, imagining what it must feel like to stand at the top, looking down at the world. Her father once told her, "Maggie, one day you'll climb that mountain, and you'll see everything in a different way." She believed him. But time has a way of slipping through your fingers. First came marriage, then children, then bills, responsibilities, and years that seemed to vanish without warning. There was always a reason to wait, always something more important than chasing an old dream. And now, at 77, with her hair silver and her body tired, the mountain still stood there, waiting. Maggie would sit by her window, looking out at the horizon, and wonder, what if I had gone? What would I have seen? Who would I have become? She was certain it was too late now, certain that the time for dreams had passed. But then, something happened. Something small, almost unnoticeable, but powerful enough to shake the fear loose. And what followed would change everything. Maggie was just 10 years old the first time she saw it. The summer air was thick with the smell of wildflowers and warm earth, and the sound of cicadas filled the air like a constant hum. Her father had taken her for one of their Sunday drives, just the two of them, winding through the narrow roads of the Blue Ridge Parkway in his old Ford, the kind that rattled every time he turned a corner. Those drives were Maggie's favorite thing in the world. They didn't have much, but when she was in that car, sitting next to her father, windows down and the wind in her hair, it felt like anything was possible. He'd always let her choose the music. She loved the old country songs, the ones her mother used to hum while doing the dishes. That day, Johnny Cash played low on the radio, and Maggie sang along, her voice light, full of youth. And then, they came around a bend, and there it was. The mountain. It rose up in front of them, tall and silent, its peaks brushed with clouds, like something out of a dream. Maggie pressed her face to the window, eyes wide. "Daddy, what's that?" He smiled, that kind of proud, quiet smile that fathers have when they're about to tell you something important. That, sweetheart, is where the sky meets the earth. She didn't quite understand what he meant, but it didn't matter. From that moment, the mountain had her heart. They pulled over at a little diner not far from the base. It was the kind of place where the tables were lined with red and white checkered cloth, and the waitresses called you honey, no matter your name. As they sat at a booth by the window, Maggie couldn't stop looking at the mountain. "Do people go up there?" she asked, curiosity burning inside her. Her father nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. "Some do. It's not easy, but if you make it to the top, they say you can see forever." She was quiet for a moment, imagining what forever looked like. "Do you think I could go there?" "One day." He reached across the table, took her small hand in his. "One day, Maggie. One day, you'll stand at the top of that mountain, and you'll see the whole world from up there." It wasn't just a promise. It was a dream, planted deep in her heart. From that day on, every time they drove that road, every time she looked out over the hills, she thought of that mountain. She'd draw pictures of it in her school books, talk about it to her friends, even dream about it at night. In her young mind, the mountain wasn't just a place. It was a symbol of strength, of possibility, of something bigger than herself. But she didn't know yet how life could change, and how dreams, if left untouched, could start to fade. Years passed, as they always do, and the mountain, once so vivid in Maggie's mind, became a quiet, distant presence. By the time she was 18, her world had already begun to shift. Her father, once full of energy and laughter, had started to slow down. The long Sunday drives became less frequent, and eventually they stopped altogether. Maggie graduated high school in the spring of 1964, the same year her father fell ill. He never told her exactly what it was. Back then, men like him didn't talk about weakness. But she could see it, in the way he winced when he stood up, the way his hands trembled slightly when he held his coffee cup. One evening, as they sat on the porch together, watching the sun dip behind the hills, she turned to him. "Daddy, do you still think I'll climb that mountain one day?" He looked at her, his eyes softer now, touched by years and pain. "I do, Maggie. But don't wait too long." She didn't understand the weight of those words at the time. After her father passed, Maggie threw herself into life. It was easier that way, to stay busy, to keep moving. She met John at the local hardware store, where she worked part-time behind the register. He wasn't the tallest or the loudest man in town, but he had kind eyes and a steady way about him that made her feel safe. They married the following summer. Their life together was simple and in many ways beautiful. They bought a small house on the edge of town, the same one Maggie still lived in. She painted the kitchen yellow, her favorite color, and filled the garden with roses and daisies. Children came, first Thomas, then Lily, and with them, new dreams, new responsibilities. Every now and then, she would catch a glimpse of the mountain. From the window of the car, or while hanging laundry in the backyard, its familiar shape would stir something inside her. She'd pause, let her eyes linger on it for a moment, and then turn back to whatever task was at hand. There was always something else to do. One year, John suggested they take a trip. "Just the two of us," he said. "We could go see that mountain of yours." Maggie smiled, her heart leaping at the thought. But then Thomas got sick, and they had to use the money for hospital bills. Later, John was offered more hours at work, and they needed the extra income. There was always something. And slowly, the dream of standing at the top began to feel like something from another life. Still, she never forgot. The mountain was always there, steady and silent, like a friend she hadn't spoken to in years, but who still waited patiently. And sometimes, late at night, when the house was quiet and everyone else was asleep, Maggie would sit by the window and whisper, almost to herself, "One day." But even she wasn't sure anymore if she believed it. Maggie always said that John was her rock. He wasn't the type of man who filled a room with noise or stories, but when he held her hand, she felt like nothing in the world could shake her. Their life together was a quiet kind of love, one built on small gestures, not grand declarations. Sunday dinners with the kids, long walks through town, evenings spent listening to the radio while she sewed and he read the newspaper. It wasn't perfect. No life is. But it was enough. And through it all, the mountain remained. In the early years of their marriage, Maggie would talk about it often. "John, we should go," she'd say, leaning into him as they sat on their porch swing. One day, he'd reply, with a gentle smile, "When the kids are older." They would sit there, imagining what it would be like. How they'd pack a lunch, drive out just like her father used to, and hike up together. They even joked about bringing a little flag to plant at the top. "The Johnson family conquers the mountain." John would laugh. But the years had their own plans. Thomas and Lily grew quickly, each with their own needs, their own troubles. Maggie and John worked hard to give them everything they could. John took on more hours at the factory, sometimes coming home so tired he could barely eat dinner. Maggie picked up sewing jobs from the neighbors, patching clothes late into the night under the dim light of their old Sears lamp. There were bills, always bills. And with every passing year, the idea of climbing that mountain seemed less like an adventure and more like a luxury they couldn't afford. Still, every so often, Maggie would bring it up. "Do you think we'll ever go?" she'd ask quietly, her voice carrying a mixture of hope and resignation. And John, ever the optimist, would kiss her forehead. "We will. I promise." But promises are delicate things. John started feeling pain in his chest one winter, brushing it off as nothing more than the cold. By spring, the doctor's words shattered their world. It was his heart. They tried everything: medication, rest, prayers whispered late at night. But 2 years later, Maggie stood alone at his funeral, clutching the only promise he couldn't keep. After John was gone, the house felt bigger, emptier. The days stretched long, filled with silence. She kept busy, because that's what she'd always done, but something inside her had dimmed. She no longer spoke of the mountain. It hurt too much. It wasn't just a dream deferred, it was a dream tied to someone who was no longer there. There were moments, of course, when the thought would creep back in. While watering the garden or folding laundry, she'd glance toward the hills and wonder, could she do it alone? But the idea felt impossible. She was older now, more fragile. The mountain wasn't just tall, it was unforgiving. And deep down, Maggie believed that some dreams were meant to fade with time, until something or someone would come into her life and remind her that even the most fragile promises can still be kept. Maggie had grown used to the silence. It was strange how something that once felt so heavy could eventually become a kind of comfort. The soft ticking of the clock on the wall, the distant hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the floorboards beneath her feet, these became her companions. She no longer expected the phone to ring, and when it did, it was usually someone selling something she didn't need. Her children called now and then, busy with their own lives far away in different states, but they always ended the conversation the same way: take care, Mom. We'll visit soon. Soon rarely came. Maggie didn't blame them. Life had a way of pulling people in different directions, and she had never wanted to be a burden. She was still strong in her own way, independent, even if the world outside seemed to be moving faster than she could keep up with. Her days followed a quiet rhythm, but every so often, something would stir in her chest, a longing she couldn't quite name. It was on a warm afternoon in late spring when everything began to shift. She was in the kitchen, peeling apples for a pie she didn't really need to bake, when she heard a knock at the door. It was soft, almost hesitant. She wiped her hands on a towel and made her way over, her knees aching with each step. When she opened the door, there stood Emily, her granddaughter, with that same spark in her eyes that Maggie had seen in her own reflection many years ago. "Grandma, I thought I'd surprise you," Emily said, holding up a small overnight bag. Maggie's heart swelled. It had been months since she'd seen her, and now, standing there in the doorway, it felt like a missing piece of her had come home. They spent the afternoon catching up, talking about everything and nothing. Emily told stories about college, about friends, about plans for the future. Maggie listened, smiling, but something about Emily's presence made her feel both young again and painfully aware of the years that had passed. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the living room in shades of gold, Emily noticed the photograph on the wall. It had always been there, but now, with fresh eyes, she saw it differently. "Who's this?" she asked, pointing to the faded image of Maggie and John, standing with the mountain in the background. Maggie walked over slowly, her hand brushing lightly over the frame. "That was taken not long after we married. Your grandpa and I used to dream about climbing that mountain." Emily tilted her head, curious. "Did you ever go?" Maggie hesitated, her throat tightening. "No, we never did. Life, well, it got in the way." Emily was quiet for a moment, then sat down beside her grandmother. "Do you still want to?" The question hung in the air, heavy and impossible. Maggie laughed softly, shaking her head. "I'm too old for dreams like that." But Emily didn't look away. She just held her gaze, her voice steady. "I don't think you are." That night, after Emily had gone to bed, Maggie sat alone, the photograph still in her hands. She traced the edges, remembering the feel of John's hand in hers, the sound of her father's voice telling her that one day she would see the world from the top. Her heart ached, not with sadness, but with something else, something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. She whispered to the empty room, "Could I really still do it?" The mountain was still there, waiting. And for the first time in a long while, Maggie wondered if it wasn't too late after all. The morning light streamed softly through the lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on the wooden floor as Maggie sat at her kitchen table, staring at her coffee. It had gone cold, untouched, but she didn't seem to notice. Her mind was far from that quiet room, wandering along winding roads and steep trails she had never walked. Emily's question echoed in her thoughts over and over again. Do you still want to? The truth was, she had never stopped wanting it. The dream had just grown silent, buried beneath years of routine and the gentle surrender that comes with age. But now, something inside her had awakened. A restless stirring, a flicker of possibility. She stood slowly, knees stiff, and made her way to the small drawer where she kept her old notebooks and letters. At the bottom, beneath forgotten receipts and birthday cards, she found a worn map. It was the one her father had used all those years ago, folded and creased from time and handling. Her fingers trembled as she opened it, tracing the familiar lines of the road that led to the base of the mountain. It felt like a lifeline, a connection to everything she had once believed was possible. She sat back down, the map spread before her, and made a decision. She was going to climb it. Later that afternoon, she called Emily into the kitchen. Her granddaughter, still sleepy-eyed from the night before, rubbed her eyes and smiled. "What's up, Grandma?" Maggie took a deep breath. "I want to do it. I want to climb the mountain." Emily's eyes widened, and for a moment, she didn't speak. Then, a smile broke across her face, wide and bright. "You mean it?" Maggie nodded, her voice firm. "I've waited long enough." They spent the rest of the day planning, looking up trails on Emily's phone, checking distances, reading about the best times to go. Maggie felt overwhelmed by the information, but Emily's enthusiasm was contagious. "We'll need to get you some good shoes, and maybe a walking stick," Emily said, already making a list. Maggie laughed. "And maybe some extra courage." The days that followed were filled with small, but significant steps. Maggie started walking every morning, just around the block at first. Her legs protested, her back ached, but with each step, she felt a little stronger. Neighbors watched curiously as she passed by, some offering friendly waves, others stopping to chat. "Getting in shape for something, Maggie?" one of them asked. She smiled, a secret tucked behind her lips. "Something like that." Emily stayed by her side, encouraging her, sometimes walking with her, sometimes just reminding her to rest. They shared meals, stories, and quiet evenings looking through old photo albums. For the first time in years, Maggie felt alive in a way she had almost forgotten. But not everyone understood. One afternoon, while visiting the small grocery store in town, Maggie ran into Mrs. Thompson, a longtime neighbor. "I hear you're planning some kind of trip," she said, raising an eyebrow. "At your age?" Maggie held her gaze, steady and calm. "Yes, I'm going to climb the mountain." Mrs. Thompson scoffed, shaking her head. "You should be careful. These old bones aren't what they used to be." Maggie nodded politely, but inside, something solidified. She wasn't going to let fear, hers or anyone else's, stop her now. That night, as she sat by the window, the stars twinkling above the distant hills, Maggie felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in a long time. The journey hadn't even begun, but already, she was changing. Step by step, breath by breath, she was becoming the woman her father always believed she could be. The morning air was crisp, cooler than usual for that time of year, as Maggie laced up her new walking shoes. They were sturdier than any she'd ever owned, with thick soles and firm support, chosen carefully with Emily's help. She stood slowly, testing the feel of them, and took a cautious step forward. They felt strange at first, unfamiliar, but steady, like the first step into something new, something unknown. Each day, Maggie pushed herself a little further. The walks around the block turned into walks down to the old church at the end of the street, then through the park where she used to take Thomas and Lily when they were small. The familiar paths brought back a flood of memories, laughter echoing through the trees, the scent of fresh-cut grass, the sound of children playing. Her body ached more than she cared to admit, but her spirit felt lighter, freer. Emily was her constant companion, cheering her on, adjusting their plans when needed, but never letting her forget why she had started. "You're stronger than you think, Grandma," she'd say, holding her arm as they walked side by side. Sometimes they'd sit together on a bench, watching the world go by, and Emily would ask about the past. Maggie found herself opening up more than she had in years, sharing stories about her father, about John, about the dreams she once had. Emily listened, eyes wide, soaking in every word. But with each step forward, the doubts crept in. There were nights when Maggie lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her heart pounding with fear. What if her body gave out halfway up the trail? What if she embarrassed herself? What if she failed? The thought of starting and not finishing haunted her more than she expected. She didn't want pity. She didn't want people to remember her as the old woman who tried and couldn't. One evening, as she sat alone, Emily came into the room, sensing something was wrong. "You're quiet tonight," she said softly, sitting beside her. Maggie hesitated, then spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if I can't do it, Emily? What if I'm just too old?" Emily reached for her hand, holding it gently. "Then at least you tried. Most people never even do that." Those words settled in her heart like a bomb. Trying, that was what mattered. Not the outcome, not the judgment of others, but the courage to take that first step, and then another and another. The next morning, Maggie woke with a renewed sense of determination. The mountain was waiting, yes, but she wasn't waiting anymore. She called the local clinic and scheduled a checkup, just to be sure her body could handle what her heart was set on. The doctor, a kind man in his 50s, listened carefully, ran a few tests, and after a thoughtful pause, smiled. "You're in better shape than most people half your age, Maggie. Just take it slow, and you'll be fine." With that reassurance, the final preparations began. Emily arranged for the trip, mapped out the route, and even found a local guide who could accompany them part of the way, just in case. Maggie packed a small bag, water, snacks, a light jacket, and an old photo of her father, worn at the edges but still precious. As the day of the climb approached, the air seemed different, charged with something invisible, something alive. Maggie felt it in her bones, in her breath, in the steady beat of her heart. She wasn't the same woman who had looked at that mountain from her kitchen window, wondering if it was too late. Now, she was ready to find out. The morning of the climb arrived wrapped in a gentle mist, the kind that made everything feel hushed and sacred. Maggie awoke before dawn, her heart beating in rhythm with the silence of the house. She moved slowly, careful not to wake Emily, and stood for a moment by the window, looking out toward the horizon. Though the mountain wasn't visible from there, she could feel its presence, steady and patient, waiting just as it always had. She dressed carefully, each piece of clothing chosen with thought, her most comfortable pants, a soft flannel shirt, the jacket John used to wear on chilly mornings. She ran her fingers over the fabric, remembering the way he'd pull it tight around her shoulders when the wind picked up. She folded the photograph of her father and slipped it into her jacket pocket, close to her heart. Emily was already awake when Maggie came into the kitchen, a thermos of coffee in hand and a bright, nervous smile on her face. "You ready, Grandma?" Maggie nodded, the weight of the day settling over her like a warm blanket. She wasn't afraid now. Not exactly. What she felt was something deeper, a quiet resolve, a sense that this was exactly where she needed to be. The drive to the mountain was long, but familiar. The roads curved and dipped through the landscape like old friends, and Maggie watched the trees blur past, each one a marker of time, of memory. They passed the diner where she had first seen the mountain with her father, and for a moment, she closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of those long-ago summers, hot asphalt, wildflowers, the faint sweetness of Coca-Cola and glass bottles. When they arrived at the trailhead, the mist had begun to lift, revealing the base of the mountain, majestic and calm. Maggie stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching beneath her feet, and looked up. The peak was hidden in clouds, but she didn't need to see it to know it was there. The guide, a man named Peter, greeted them with a warm smile and a gentle tone. "We'll take it slow," he assured her. "No rush, no pressure. Just one step at a time." Maggie nodded, gripping her walking stick, and took her first step onto the trail. The path was uneven, winding through dense woods where the sunlight filtered in thin beams, casting long shadows. Birds called out from the trees, their songs mingling with the rustle of leaves and the distant sound of water. Maggie focused on her breathing, on the steady rhythm of her feet, on the feeling of the earth beneath her. As they climbed, the trail grew steeper, the air thinner. Her legs burned, her chest tightened, and there were moments when she had to stop, leaning on her stick, closing her eyes to steady herself. Emily stayed close, offering water, a hand, a word of encouragement. But Maggie didn't want help. Not really. What she wanted was to feel every part of this journey, the struggle, the strain, the slow, relentless progress. Halfway up, they reached a small clearing, and Maggie sank onto a rock, catching her breath. The view from there was already beautiful, the valley stretching out below in soft greens and browns, dotted with tiny houses and winding roads. She could have stopped there. No one would have blamed her. But she wasn't done. She looked at Emily, who knelt beside her, worry in her eyes. "We can rest here as long as you need," Emily said gently. Maggie smiled, reaching into her jacket to touch the photo. "I didn't come this far to stop halfway." And so, they continued. The trail narrowed as they moved higher, the ground beneath their feet growing rough and uneven. The trees, once thick and sheltering, began to thin, giving way to jagged rocks and open sky. Each step demanded more from Maggie, more strength, more breath, more belief. The sun had risen fully now, casting a golden hue over the landscape, warming her face as sweat trickled down her back. Her legs trembled with effort, and her hands gripped the walking stick so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The climb was harder than she had imagined, steeper, more relentless. There were moments when doubt crept in, whispering that she should stop, that no one would think less of her if she turned back. But she kept moving, one slow, deliberate step at a time. Emily was quiet now, sensing that Maggie needed space, not words. She walked just behind her, ready if needed, but trusting in the silent determination that had brought them this far. The guide, Peter, had fallen back, giving them privacy, respecting the sacredness of this climb. The wind picked up, cool and sharp, carrying with it the scent of pine and stone. Maggie paused, closing her eyes, feeling the breeze on her face. It reminded her of her father's hands, rough but gentle, lifting her up when she was small, pointing out the stars on summer nights. She could almost hear his voice, low and steady. "One day, Maggie. One day." Her knees ached with every movement, her breath coming in short gasps, but she pressed on. The trail twisted sharply, and as she rounded the bend, the ground opened before her. They were close now. She could feel it in the air, in the way the sky seemed nearer, wider. Her heart pounded, a mix of exhaustion and anticipation. But just as hope began to swell, her foot slipped on a loose stone, sending a jolt of pain through her ankle. She cried out, catching herself on a nearby rock, her body trembling. Emily rushed to her side, fear flashing in her eyes. "Grandma, are you okay?" Maggie nodded, though tears stung her eyes. I need a minute." They sat there, the mountain silent around them, as Maggie breathed deeply, fighting the urge to give in. The pain was sharp, but it wasn't just the physical that weighed on her. It was the years of waiting, the fear that maybe she had waited too long. Emily held her hand, squeezing it gently. "We can stop, Grandma. You've already done so much." Maggie looked at her, the lines on her face deep with emotion. "But I haven't seen it yet. I need to see it." She stood slowly, testing her weight on the sore ankle. It held. Barely. But it was enough. The final stretch was the hardest. Each step was a battle, each breath a victory. The path climbed upward, the rocks growing larger, the sky opening wider. And then, without warning, the trail leveled out. Maggie stepped forward, her eyes lifting, her heart almost too full to beat. There it was. The view. The world stretched out before her, vast and endless, the valleys below painted in shades of green and gold, rivers winding like ribbons of light, the sky above so wide, so impossibly blue, it felt like she could fall into it. She stood still, every ache, every fear, every moment of doubt melting away. Tears filled her eyes, but she didn't wipe them. She let them fall, let them carry the weight of a lifetime. Emily stood beside her, silent, awed. Maggie reached into her jacket, pulling out the photo, holding it up to the wind. "We made it, Daddy. We made it, John." And in that moment, Standing at the top of the mountain, Maggie wasn't 77 years old. She wasn't fragile or tired or afraid. She was whole. She was free. They stayed at the summit longer than they had planned. Time seemed to slow there, suspended in the thin, cool air that carried the scent of wild grass and distant pine. Maggie sat on a flat rock, her legs stretched out before her, the warmth of the sun gently easing the ache in her body. Emily sat close, but didn't speak. She knew some moments were too full for words, and this was one of them. Maggie looked out over the vast landscape, her eyes tracing the gentle curves of the hills, the shimmering threads of rivers far below, the faint outline of roads winding through the valleys. She breathed deeply, filling her lungs with air that felt purer, freer than anything she had known in years. This was the view her father had promised her. This was the place John had dreamed of seeing by her side. She closed her eyes and felt them both, not as memories, but as presence, as steady and real as the ground beneath her feet. Her mind wandered through the years, all the times she had looked at this mountain from afar, telling herself it was too late. She thought of the moments she had almost given up, the nights filled with silent doubts, the days where routine had dulled the edges of her dreams. And yet, here she was. She hadn't just climbed a mountain. She had climbed out of the quiet resignation that had crept into her life, out of the soft fear that told her dreams were for the young. She had proven something to herself, something she never truly believed she could. As the sun began its slow descent, casting long golden rays across the peaks, Maggie stood once more, steadying herself. She took one last look at the view, her heart full, and smiled. It was worth every step, she whispered. The journey down was quieter, filled with a peaceful exhaustion. Each step felt lighter, not because the trail was easier, but because she carried less now, less doubt, less fear, less regret. When they reached the base, the world looked different, not because it had changed, but because she had. Back home, the familiar sights and sounds greeted her like old friends. The ticking clock, the creaking floors, even the soft hum of the refrigerator, they no longer felt like the background to a small, quiet life. They were the foundation of a life well lived, and now, deeply renewed. Neighbors came by, curious and amazed, some bringing flowers, others just their admiration. Word had spread, and Maggie found herself at the center of a story that touched more people than she could have imagined. But she didn't need praise. What filled her now was a calm pride, the kind that settles deep inside and never leaves. One evening, as she sat with Emily on the porch, the sky painted in soft purples and pinks, Maggie turned to her. "You know, the hardest part wasn't the climb." Emily looked at her, waiting. "It was believing I could start it." She reached out, gently placing her hand on Emily's. "Don't ever let fear tell you that it's too late. The moment you start listening, you stop living." Emily nodded, her eyes shining. And to those who are still watching, who might be holding on to a dream, wondering if the time has passed, let Maggie's story be a reminder. It's never too late to start. Never too late to believe. If this story touched your heart, take a moment and share your dream in the comments. What's the one thing you still hope to do? The mountain you still want to climb? Like this video and join us here, because together, we are proof that it's never too late to dream.